Hi there, friends. Welcome to the Eat, Pray, Run podcast. I'm your host, Dorina Lazo Gilmore-Young, and I'm here in the office/studio with my hubby, Sean. We are excited about season 4 of our podcast and inviting you into some interesting conversations about food, faith, and fitness. And if you've listened to our podcast before, I'm thrilled to have you back at the table. If you're new around here, I want to just say welcome.
We are passionate about our faith and sharing it with our listeners. In every episode, you can expect a thoughtful story, an engaging interview, and a little prayer.
We're hosting these conversations with athletes, artists, chefs, coaches, and authors about the intersection of food, culture, travel, running, and of course, faith. As we continue with season 4 today, join us for the adventure chasing God's glory as we eat, pray, and run. Friends, every week I like to feature a story that I've written. Maybe it's an article or a devotional, something that is meant to point you back to God's glory. And this week I'm going to be sharing with you out of Everyday Faith magazine, which is a magazine that I write for. It's put out by Dayspring and Encourage. And this is an article I wrote about hospitality, that hospitality is more than just entertaining. My daughters gather at the stove, giggling and chatting. The familiar fragrances of garlic, oregano, and basil permeate the air. The girls take turns swirling the ruby red tomato sauce and meatballs in the big pot with a wooden spoon. Be careful with my meatballs, Nana Maria chides playfully. You don't want to break any of them up. My Italian mama, whom my girls call Nana, stands at our kitchen island with my youngest daughter. They are stuffing jumbo pasta shells with spoonfuls of filling, which includes spinach, ricotta cheese, cream cheese, and ground beef. My dad butters thick slices of Italian bread. My husband, Sean, is in his usual place at the kitchen sink, trying to get ahead of the dirty dishes situation. And we are all in the kitchen together, moving through a cacophony of clinking dishes, laughter, singing, colorful ingredients, and inviting aromas. It's a feast for the senses. Food ignites memories for me. I'm transported back to my childhood growing up in the kitchen with my mama, grandmas, and aunties. I come from a long line of women who pride themselves on serving up delectable food and nourishing people well. I love to gather people in my home and deliver meals when friends have babies or after loved ones have gone on to heaven. Food is my love language, and hospitality is my jam. And then a global pandemic hit in March 2020. We were all forced to stay at home and social distance. Gatherings were canceled. Our schooling, life group, Bible study, and work-related meetings were moved to Zoom. If we wanted face-to-face time with people, we had to do it through a screen instead of across the table. I often felt frustrated and lonely. Maybe you can relate. I had to learn a different way of expressing hospitality. I couldn't feed and gather people in the way I had in the past. And I also had to reckon with my theology of hospitality. Could I still be hospitable even if I couldn't open my home? This past year, Jesus invited me to go deeper in my understanding of what hospitality means. And I've discovered that it is much more than just entertaining. Hospitality is an invitation to rest. Abraham models this in Genesis 18 when he invites 3 strangers who show up at his tent during the hottest part of the day. And Abraham says, if it pleases you, stop here for a while, rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. That's from Genesis chapter 18, verses 3 and 4. Abraham provides for these travelers by greeting them warmly, giving them water to wash their feet, and offering nourishing food, and ultimately a place to rest. During the pandemic, God showed me that one of the most powerful ways I could offer hospitality during this time of crisis was to invite my parents into our home and be isolated with them. This was challenging at first, especially because my dad and I don't always agree on politics. But even in an election year, we learned to rest together and nourish well. We enjoyed cooking, playing games, watching movies, and doing puzzles together, and my daughters deepened their relationships with their grandparents. I discovered part of hospitality is also offering a safe place for people to share their stories. In Luke chapter 8, Jesus is on his way to heal the sick daughter of a ruler of the synagogue. Along his journey, he is interrupted by a woman who has suffered from bleeding for 12 years. She spent her life savings on treatment and healers. The woman reached out to touch Jesus' garment, believing in faith that simply touching him would bring healing. Jesus turned to heal her publicly and then invited her to share her truth with those listening. During the past year, racial tension has continued to spread in our country like a matchstick kindling. Fellow friends of color have suffered and grieved deeply. I felt challenged to listen well, to lament, and to invest time in reading the stories of my brothers and sisters. Listening to each other's stories is a powerful way we can show hospitality and invite healing. I've learned hospitality is also an opportunity to sacrifice for others, especially foreigners, strangers, and the poor. God has a merciful heart for the vulnerable. In Luke chapter 14, 12 to 14, Jesus tells the parable of the great banquet, and he challenges listeners not to just invite their friends and neighbors, but to extend hospitality to those who cannot repay the favor and are most in need. Studying this passage this year challenged me to think beyond the friends and family I normally would invite to my table. I was inspired by our church and other local organizations that provided for orphans, kids in our city who were schooling alone, and families that needed food. I recently hosted my first Bible study in my home since March 2020. As I opened in prayer, the tears caught in my throat because I was so filled with unexpected joy to have women sitting at my table. I served up warm, gooey brownies and local strawberries, along with a new perspective on hospitality. I do not want to forget what the pandemic years have taught me. Hospitality is much more than fancy dinner parties and spoiling my friends. Hospitality is a generosity that runs deeper and wider than I ever imagined. This article was published in Everyday Faith magazine, and you can find that magazine at Dayspring. I will put the link in the comments if you would like to snag a copy, and I hope this has inspired you to think a little bit more about hospitality. I'm so excited to introduce our guest to you today. She is actually a friend that I made through Instagram, and we have a lot of people in common. And I've been following her for a while. I just love seeing what she's doing. Jess Thomas is a native New Yorker, but she resides in the hills of Tennessee. And in the culinary world, she was actually a personal chef. So she has done cooking segments for WBIR, Knoxville's NBC affiliate, on the University of Tennessee. She does these fun videos on Instagram. She also conducts in-home classes and in event spaces. So she has been all over the place with her recipes and her innovation. She also worked behind the scenes on Food Network's Chopped, which happens to be one of my favorite shows, and I love to watch it with my daughters. She's been part of the Magnolia Network, and she is the National Director of Student Programming for Christian Community Health Fellowship. After graduating from seminary, Jess discipled many different people and taught scripture for 25 years through the church, which she helped plant. She's also had connection with Youth for Christ and MOPS International, as well as InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Jess, I just want to welcome you here to Eat, Pray, Run. Thanks for being with me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, tell us a little bit more about yourself. I did the official bio, but we want to know, where do you live? Anything you'd like to share about your family and how you spend your days?
We live in East Tennessee, and if people know Knoxville, we're an hour north of Knoxville, and we moved here 22 years ago, thinking we'd just be here for a couple of years. My husband and I thought that we would be doing mission work in a different country, but after being here a few years and doing some survey trips, we realized that God was calling us to stay here longer term. It's a tiny town. It's only 2,000 people, and I'm an extrovert. So I made sure I knew, everybody when we came here. So I would volunteer at the library when I had 2 little kids and got to know people in the town that way, and at the local grocery store, starting a mom's group. And I was like, oh, I need people. It wasn't hard at all. The people here are super friendly. So that's where we live. But I am originally from New York. So I do miss my New York bagels and my New York pizza. My parents still live there, and we try and go at least once a year. But yeah, that is where I am. And I do too many things. I do less now that my kids are grown up and gone. But yeah, as you can hear from my bio, like I'm a jack of all trades type of thing, master of none.
I love this kind of intersection that you have between food and faith and travel and even just your mission heart. So I want to dig in and ask you some questions about that. And let's start with food. We are Eat, Pray, Run. And so we got to talk about eating first. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about your cultural heritage and how that informs your cooking and your connection with food.
My parents came from Kerala, India, and they had actually lived in different parts of India after they moved out from their home. But they kept their Kerala roots, especially when it came to food. So when they came to the States, and then I was born, like that's what we would eat every day, at least twice a day. I didn't have a lot of exposure to foods outside of that, unless it was like in our high school cafeteria, or like I'd watch commercials. I'd be like, oh, Burger King, that sounds good. And so fast forward, when I had my own family and I had to cook for them, my husband, who's also originally from Kerala, loves Kerala food. So I tried to start learning how to cook, and I learned a lot of it from my mother-in-law. But because I'm truly like American in my palate, and New York is like a melting pot, and I went to college in Boston, so I was learning about foods from like all over the world. So the way that I cook or decide what to cook is, what do I feel like eating? I feel like eating pad thai. I feel like eating nachos. I feel like eating jambalaya. So it's really very selfish and self-focused of what I cook. It's based on what I'm in the mood for.
Well, isn't that how we all are? I mean, I am right there with you on that one. And I love how just that influence of like your cultural heritage or where you and your husband came from, but then also the places where you've lived really kind of informs that cooking and that food journey. Now, let's talk about New York for a minute. I actually went to New York City this past spring break with my daughter for her 16th birthday. And I think it was you who sent me a list of restaurants. We went to some of those restaurants and it was so fun. So tell us a little bit more about New York City and just how growing up there brought out the foodie in you. You mentioned it a little bit, but I'd love to hear.
So I grew up in Long Island, like right outside of Queens. I was born in Queens, and Queens really is a cultural melting pot. You can find food from like everywhere there, except Mexican, because the Latino population like came up like from Puerto Rico more so than Mexican. And like that area is not very agricultural. So it's really far from Mexico for people to come. So I didn't actually have real Mexican food till I left the Northeast, but I worked in Manhattan for 2 years after I graduated college. And that's when I was exposed to like gourmet cooking. Like I'd never seen arugula before that, or Black Forest ham. I'm like, what are these amazing things? But then I also got to try Afghani food for the first time and other cultural places that I was not exposed to. But that's one of the things I miss about New York is like you can get really yummy food from like everywhere in the world.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite things about being there. I feel like every block was just filled with so many options from so many different places. And you could go to the Bagel place and wait in line, but then you could also go get, the classic New York pizza or go to an Indian restaurant, dim sum. Oh my goodness, I could have stayed there for weeks just eating. And I'm curious because I've seen on your blog and also your Instagram that you have soul food as kind of the name of what you do or your Instagram feed. So tell us a little bit more about where that name comes from and what it means to you.
That definitely has been like the intersection of like faith and like hobby, where I really learned how to cook because we live in a rural town. And first I had to feed my kids, but when we were planting this church, the way I was doing college ministry, and the way to a college student's heart is through food. So that's how I learned how to like cook in bulk. And because we lived in the South, it's the first time I learned how to make biscuits and gravy, cooking with bacon grease. I'd never heard of strawberry pretzel salad until I came here. And then it became like the staple on our Easter menu. And so I found really what like reached people, first through students, but then just our community in general. When they eat well, it really does minister to their soul, and they're just more open to like hearing you. Conversations happen organically around the dinner table, and it's an excuse to spend more time with people. So that ministry of hospitality, it was very evident. So that's why when I first started my personal chef business, I called it soul food, in that it's a connection to one's soul when you nourish them physically with food.
So you're preaching my heart right here, just that message of hospitality and really reaching our souls with food. I'm a big believer that it's also one of the ways that we experience God and his glory, and we get to share that with people across the table. I love that you made that part of your business too, and that was the heart of how you reached people. Now, one of the things we mentioned in your bio is that you had some experience working on the TV show Chopped. And I would love to hear more about what that was like, kind of the behind the scenes view, what you did, all of that.
Yeah, that is definitely a Jesus thing. So it's 2020. New York is like having a terrible time. And usually Chopped is filmed in New York. But Discovery is the overall network that owns Food Network. And they are based just an hour from my house. And they were trying to find local people who are in the culinary world. And so because I had been a personal chef, because I had done the TV demos on our local news station, my name was out there. And so I had the chance to work behind the scenes on the show, which was like so much better than being on the show, because I'm confident in my cooking skills, but not in 20 minutes. And it was so great because, one, during the pandemic, everybody is just like fearful and isolated. And I'm already isolated because I live in the hills. But because they had like such great COVID precautions, we were getting tested 3 days a week, masks, shields, like everything. And then you couldn't even be in the building unless you tested negative. So I was safely able to be with people every single day, which was awesome for me. And then second, it was not like a lot of the New York crew came down to Tennessee for the filming. So I was able to be with my native New Yorkers, which was so fun because I haven't been around New Yorkers. And there's just like a different style and swagger to New Yorkers that is completely different from the South. So that was super fun as well. And then the third thing is I had been mainly around Christians for like 25 years because of working in church ministry, college ministry, youth ministry. And so I had very little exposure to non-Christians since I like left New York working in PR and advertising. So this was the first time in 25 years that I'm around majority people who don't know Jesus, and they are only exposed to what they see in the news about Christianity. And so it was awesome being a woman of color who followed Jesus and to be able to speak about who Jesus is and not to talk about the church or the institution of Christianity, but just like, here, this is my experience as a follower of Jesus. And it's not about rules, it's about the person of Jesus. And these are the reasons why I follow Jesus. And even more talking about Jesus, I was able to listen to people where they were spiritually, because there was a lot of downtime where we could have conversations. We're like all scrubbing potatoes to put on set. And so you're just hanging out as you're doing that. And then there was so much hurt that there were people who grew up in the church that were hurt by the church and kind of then be like, oh, church is toxic and Christianity is toxic. And I don't blame them because of like what they're telling me. So I was able to like be an ear and kind of show like that's not what Jesus meant, and that's not how he speaks, and that's not how he treated people. So it really was like a great opportunity. It was like God opening my eyes to like, hey, you've been doing like discipleship all these years, but I want you to talk to people, have spiritual conversations, but really be my ear for them. So in between all of the foodie things, I got to do that.
Oh, it's so beautiful. It's like God positioned you for that certain time, and you got to be kind of a food evangelist in a way. It was like food was the avenue, But I love that you just took that opportunity to have real conversations with people and show them compassion and share your own life. And that's not at all what I was expecting you to say. Because when we watch Chopped, Chopped feels like this really hardcore kind of competitive show. And, you feel the energy and the tension in the room because they're trying to cook quickly and all of that. So that's a surprisingly beautiful story of behind the scenes.
It is that hard if you're a competitor, because we don't interact with the contestants at all because it's a competition, right? They give away $10,000 every episode. And so there's a lot of like rules. So yeah, we'd actually don't. So it's really the staff that I was able to interact. And then I got to make chai like on the show. Like if there was downtime, I would make chai and then like share it with people. And I would make North Indian masala chai, but then I would make Kerala chaya and then have have another opportunity to share conversations about different aspects of culture, that India is not homogenous, that every region is different. And, people were like, I had no idea that I could have chai with like just cardamom. I'm like, you can have chai with like no spices because it's really the method of cooking, not necessarily all the specific spices in there. So anyway, it was like a really good time. It was a lot of work. It was minimum 12-hour days. I had, an hour commute at 4:30 in the morning, but it was totally worth it. And we only filmed for like 5 to 6 weeks. So I did it in the fall of 2020, the fall of 21, and then I did a week in 22. But now they've moved back to New York filming. So my stint is over.
Well, I love hearing more of that behind the scenes. Thanks for sharing. And just that you got to share chai with those who are working. Chai is definitely my beverage of choice. And I know it's probably pretty trendy now, but it is my go-to. And what I love is when people make the homemade version and you get to just really experience kind of the nuances with the different spices. I like my chai with a little more cardamom, but I also like the spicy ones, the masala chais as well.
I am definitely more of like for taste and treating myself, it's like just cardamom or no spices. But as I've aged and I know like the medicinal properties of the spices, I'm like, oh, I should probably like have some ginger and have some cloves and like, because it's all healthy.
So true. Oh, goodness. That's good. Well, I'd like to ask you if you have a signature dish you make.
It depends on who I'm cooking for. So, especially in where I live in the South, a lot of people are not exposed to Kerala food or South Indian food. So, if I have the chance, like the dish that people seem to, or they may have said, oh, I don't like curry. I'm like, well, I don't know if you know what curry is because curry means something different in Thailand, in India, in Japan. And in where I'm from in India, curry wheat is like equivalent to gravy or sauce. So we say curry as kind of like a generic term. But sambar, which is a like vegetable stew made with like tamarind, that's the dish that I make for people to introduce them to Indian food if they've not really had it. And it tastes so different from like butter chicken and naan and tandoori chicken, so they don't expect it. And most of the people like enjoy that. And then I will make dosa. So depending on what part of India, it's dosa, dosha, dosai. Depends. So I grew up calling it dosha. So dosha, which is I make it like thinner and a little bit crispy, dipped in the sambar, and then like a coconut chutney. That's what I would make if I'm introducing people to like my part of India. If you are looking for Southern food, I will make you sausage biscuits and Cajun gravy because that's one of those dishes I feel like really comfortable doing. And my gravy is super flavorful. And most of the gravy down here, the only thing that's in there is like salt and pepper, which I can't do that. I'm like, I need a little more flavor than that, especially if you're putting it on a biscuit. Like the biscuit already is like not flavorful. It's just like a great texture. So either of those, I would say.
Agreed. Well, okay, now I'm like drooling on myself. That all sounds amazing. And I love following you on Instagram. So I'll just say for our listeners, go check out Jess's Instagram. It's Jess Soul Food. And you can even see some of these dishes that she's talking about. I know you showed just a quick video yesterday, even of making the dosha. And I was looking at it, I was watching, I was like, wow, this is so interesting because I see that there's many different cultures that make kind of a similar flatbread. We've made crepes before, like the French version of crepes. And so as I was watching your dough kind of bubble up, I was like, oh, that looks like the crepes. And then I've also made injera bread before, which is popular in Ethiopia. It's kind of the base with serving Ethiopian foods, and it's a much like larger version of it. But I was watching it and thinking, okay, so that's like the sound, that's the sizzle that you listen for to make sure that the injera bread is cooked correctly as well. So I love the kind of crossover. I think you put a spice mixture on your dosha. Was that right?
Yeah, which is sometimes you can get something called gunpowder dosha, which is like a hot mixture that you put on there. And I don't have that. So this is just chaat masala, just because I was like, I want like a little spice, but that's not normal. That was just like my thing.
It's your creative thing. Okay,
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about this a little bit before as well, but I am just wondering how your love for food intersects with your faith.
An answer that you're not going to expect is a negative way, because at different points in my life, I've realized food is an idol. And so at one point, I was 40 pounds overweight, and people be like, oh, you were pregnant. Blah, blah. I'm like, no, it was my sin of gluttony. And so that was like an issue that God dealt with me, that even though I love food, there comes a point when I'm putting it as an idol. And I feel like our churches don't focus on that, because there are so many vices. They're like, don't do this, don't do that. But then there's church potluck or dinners. And then there's this concept of we are allowed to eat as much as we want or gorge ourselves, or like that concept of like, oh, I'm so stuffed, I can't breathe. But we don't recognize that's actually a good thing. And God did not design us to not breathe. And so I was like in that mindset of like always eating like that. And it wasn't even eating, you know, how people have emotional eating because they're like sad or distressed. No, that mine was purely like, this is yummy. I'm going to eat the whole thing. And so the intersection of faith and food for me was like God saying, like, I made this to enjoy, to have pleasure. It's beautiful. It's art, but it's like, you shouldn't be doing it too much in excess, just like anything else. And so I actually went through this weight loss journey based on, am I willing when I'm craving anything because I think it's awesome to like submit that to God and be like, God, do I really need to eat this? And even praying like, okay, God, you designed my body to like feel hunger when I should eat. And then I realized I had lost that sense of discernment of hunger, because I was just always like, I feel like eating this. And so I'd eat it. So, but yeah, I lost weight a lot. I mean, I did also healthier practices, but a lot of it was that being mindful. So we talk about mindful eating nowadays. So for me, that was like my journey 22 years ago, was to be mindful of what I eat. And to this day, it's still like my like number one sin that I go to is the sin of gluttony, because I can get away with it because it's very prominent in the culture. That's something I'm like, try to be more mindful of.
Thank you for being willing to share that and share kind of vulnerably there. But I think that a lot of us can relate to that. And I for sure am convicted because food is one of my things that I, enjoy deeply. But I love the way that you went on that journey with God and you filtered it through, am I choosing gluttony? Am I choosing to enjoy what He's created? Those are some really good questions for us to consider. Thanks for sharing those. So I always love to ask this question, and it may be related to food. It may not be related to food, but one of the things that I like to talk about in my writing and also with those I interview is how we experience God's glory. And so I'm wondering, how do you experience God's glory in your everyday life, in this present season of your life?
One is like literally where I live, like my backyard is the hills of Appalachia. And so to be able to like look out my window like I do not take it for granted every single day. I'm like, Jesus, you are amazing. Like how beautiful this place is. And I feel like God also gave that as a gift because I'm not living in a more urban suburban area. I don't have a lot of things to go out to like do. Like I can't even run out and pick up, like simple groceries. And so I feel like God gave that like beauty to me as a gift and as a comfort, and of like, hey, I'm with you always. So I would say I experienced God's glory through that. And like literally almost every night I'm like, wait, look at that sunset. And I'd like run and get my camera. And my husband's like, it's there every day. I'm like, I know. And I don't want to miss it. So definitely through nature. And I love hiking. And I think the whole process of cooking for me, like, because I'm not a crafty, creative person, except for like cooking, Chariots of Fire. I feel God's glory when I run.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
I feel God's
Little.
glory, like, yes, when I'm cooking, and just like how everything like comes together, and even like the sounds of the sizzles and the knife and all that ASMR stuff. Definitely through that. And the third way is like actually through my regular job of ministry, pouring into students. I mainly are graduate healthcare students, but also undergrad students. And when they catch what does it mean to be loved by God and want to serve Christ because of that, it's like this yay God moment for me of you've like touched them where like they needed you the most. So, which I don't get to do as often because I don't see my students regularly, whereas like I eat regular and look at my window regularly.
Oh, girl, we are soul sisters. Those are like
Aw.
3 ways that I love to experience God's glory. And I love watching some of your videos too of where you live. I actually went to graduate school in Roanoke, Virginia, so kind of the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, and learned to really just appreciate those. I grew up a city girl as well. I grew up in Chicago. And so I feel like, sunrise and sunset over the mountains is really just a special thing where I feel like God is just, like you said, giving us a little gift every day. My kids know that we are glory chasers as a family. We look for God's glory. We run out there with our cameras or our phones and definitely, try to capture it, although it never does it justice.
Mhm.
So I can relate to that so much. And as well in the kitchen, just the experience that we have in cooking, I feel like is a beautiful way to connect with the creator. Okay, so you mentioned your real job. Tell us a little bit about that. What job are you doing in this season?
Yeah, because the cooking thing started as a hobby that was a career for a couple of years, and now it's like very sporadic. And my regular job, so I went to seminary and felt like I was calling me into like disciple making of some sort. So I learned how to teach scripture. So we planted a church. I was on the church planning team out here and spent 20 years teaching adults and college students how to study scripture, which I first learned through InterVarsity Christian Fellowship when I was a college student. So even though I grew up in church, that's really where I learned how to like follow Jesus, how to like discern what God was saying through his word. And then I transitioned from personal chef to working for a Christian Community Health Fellowship. So it's a ministry that engages, equips, and encourages Christians to live out the gospel in marginalized communities amongst the poor in the name of Jesus. And so there are half the members of CCHF work for CCHF clinics around the country. And the mark of a CCHF clinic is that they are a faith-based clinic focused on Jesus and that they are in an underserved community. So giving people who don't have health insurance, the working poor, people who are on sliding scale, like that can only afford so much, that's where our clinics are at. And it's where people will say, oh, wait, that's not the best part of town. We're like, exactly, because that's where if Jesus came today and was ministering, that's where he would be. So, and that's how we ended up moving here 20 years ago, is working. My husband got a job here working at a clinic for those who have been affected by the poverty in Appalachia, especially when coal mining camps closed down, logging camps closed down. So I specifically work with graduate healthcare students, so medical students, PA students, nurse practitioner students, and find them resources to encourage them to stay on the path if they feel God is calling them to be missional. And when I say missional, I don't mean going to another country to do like a clinic for a week, but missional really is like how you practice everything. John Perkins is our founder from 40 years ago.
Wow.
And so he talks about relocation. Like, are you physically going to be in the presence of the people that you're serving? Because then it's not an us and them mentality, because we're all just neighbors and we do life together. Redistribution with wealth. Is there going to be access to the same types of resources for the poor as the rich when it comes to healthcare? And reconciliation, because a lot of our clinics are in Black and Brown communities that have been and a lot of people have not been able to get the healthcare needs met because of redlining and race issues, so that the concept of reconciliation. So that's kind of like where, so for our students, I try and find them places where they can do rotations during their school, so they can actually live, because when you do a mission trip, like you're gone for a week or two, it's very glamorous. You don't get to feel what it's really like. When you do a rotation at our clinic, you actually are spending time in that neighborhood, getting to know the providers who have given up like lucrative jobs to be in these communities, and most of them are away from their families, just as if they were missionaries in another country. So I try and find other summer opportunities, gap year, that kind of thing for students. So then by the end of their training, they don't lose that vision that God has called them to serve. So I get to know them, pray with them. We have a conference for them every year. So that's like my main job. But I've always done it virtually because students are around the country. So I go and speak at different campuses and do presentations whenever I get the chance to. So I'll be going to Dallas in a couple of weeks actually and speaking there. So I love like traveling and just meeting with the students, one-on-one personally.
Thanks for taking time to share that. I'm a big fan of John Perkins and just his work, and so much work that he's done around the country. And I love that you're using your passions, you're using your gifts, and it's so interwoven. It's beautiful seeing how you use that in your vocation, seeing how you use that in the culinary arts, and probably even cooking for your family. Thanks for sharing your story with us today. Okay, one last question that I like to ask my guests is, how can we support you?
Number one, if you know any students who are wanting to go into healthcare, so they're pre-med in undergrad, or they're already in graduate school, nurse practitioner, PA, med school, anything like that, send them to me, because I will like provide them with resources. Like if they're like wanting to do it for the glory of Christ, I can help them in that journey. So send all those students to me is number one.
Okay.
And then like for the foodie things, which, when you talk about the intersection, that's actually been great, because my foodie world, like on my Instagram, you can follow me there. When you're on TV, people like put you on this pedestal, like, wow, you worked for Top. Wow, you cooked on TV. And they're willing to listen to you. So then I enter people's lives that way, and then bring it around of like, but actually what I do is this. So it's been neat to have that bridge and that connection. So follow me at Jess Soul Food, but then like at Jess CCHF, Jessie at CCHF is my other Instagram handle.
Oh, thanks so much. Okay, we will definitely put those links in the comments, in the show notes, so people can connect with you. And it's just been a joy for me to be able to connect with you. So thanks for taking some time out, Jess. I actually would love to close in prayer, and I'd love to just pray over you if that's okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
God, we thank you for this time we've had together today. And I thank you for Jess and her willingness to go deep with us and sharing her story, sharing her heart, sharing her passions. And it's so clear to me that your glory is woven all throughout her life. And so I pray that you would just continue to multiply her message, her ministry, that you would put a hedge of protection around her and her husband and their family. I pray that you would continue to make those divine connections between people that she wants to connect with in the healthcare industry and also in the food industry. And I pray for all of those listeners today who have heard this conversation. If there's anything that just pricks their heart that they want to learn more about or are curious about, God, I pray that you would come alongside them and that they would know that you very personally care about their story and that you would help them in making those connections as well. We lift up this time to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Before we go, I wanted to share with you one of my books. Since we have a little food theme going on today, I wanted to share Cora Cook's Ponsi. This is my children's book that was published several years ago now. It actually won the Asian American Librarians Association Book of the Year for children. And this book features a little girl named Cora who is learning how to cook a traditional Filipino dish called pancit. So this is a children's picture book. Part of what I do is being able to read this book and share it in classrooms and in schools. around the country, and I hope you will check it out. We'll put the link in the comments. And this is a great book that you could offer as a gift for your child's classroom or maybe for a grandchild. It's a fun gift to give for birthday gifts. This is a book that was published originally by Shen's Books, now Lee and Low Books. And you can also look out for some of my other children's books that are going to be releasing in 2023 and 2024. Thanks for joining us today, friends, for the Eat, Pray, Run podcast. I hope you like this fun focus on food and the inspiring stories that Jess Thomas shared with us. We will be back here next Wednesday for the next episode of Eat, Pray, Run, and we hope that you will join us. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and hop over to my website at dorinagilmore.com and sign up for my weekly Glorygram, which is a special letter I deliver every Saturday straight to your inbox. And I include lots of links to resources and encouragement for you.